It was a calm summer morning in Australia's Blue Mountains. Commuters boarded their train as they did every day, expecting nothing more than a routine ride into Sydney. But just after 8:20 a.m, on a narrow stretch of track hidden by rock cuttings and sharp curves, two trains were about to meet in the worst possible way. Within seconds, steel would collide with steel, 7 lives were lost, more than 50 people were injured, and the disaster shocked an entire nation. But this wasn't just an accident. It was the result of broken equipment, poor communication, and rules that left drivers guessing. This is the story of the Glenbrook rail disaster, and why 7 passengers never made it home that day. Glenbrook is a town in southeastern Australia with a population of just over 5,000 people as of 2016. It lies in the state of New South Wales, Wales, about 34 miles or 55 kilometres west of Sydney, and around 64.5 miles or 104 kilometres southeast of Bathurst. Glenbrook sits along the Blue Mountains line, a key part of the main Western Line in New South Wales. This mostly electrified railway carries thousands of commuters every day between Sydney's Central Station and towns reaching as far as Bathurst. The closer the line runs to Sydney, the more tracks it has, from a single track in some areas to as many as 6 near the city. While most trains are passenger services, the line is also shared with freight trains and long-distance express services. The first train involved in the crash was the Indian Pacific, a famous long-distance service that crosses the Australian continent. It runs from Sydney on the Pacific Ocean, west to Perth on the Indian Ocean, and then back again. On the day of the accident, the train was travelling eastbound towards Sydney. It was a massive train, 16 passenger cars offering both seats and sleeper cabins, with a 2-level car carrier attached at the rear. The passenger cars were owned and staffed by Great Southern Railway, while the locomotive and drivers were supplied by National Rail Corporation under a hook and pull contract. The second train involved in the crash was Service W534, a commuter run from Lithgow to Sydney. It was operated by NSW Trainlink using a V-set, a 4-car double-deck electric train. The specific unit was numbered DIM 8067, built in 1982 as part of the third production batch. A V-set could carry as many as 416 passengers and reach speeds of up to 71 miles or 115 kilometres per hour. The exact number of people on board that morning was never confirmed. In the early morning of December 2nd, 1999, the Indian Pacific was nearing the end of its long journey. It had left Perth on November 29th, crossing the continent towards Sydney. At Lithgow Station, about 34 miles or 54 kilometres northwest of Glenbrook, command of the train passed to Driver Marshall, who would guide it through the final stretch of the Blue Mountains. Before moving further, it's important to understand how signals are set up along this line. Tracks heading towards Sydney are called the up line, while trains going west are on the down line. Signals between Lithgow and Sydney are numbered by their distance in miles from Sydney Central Station. For example, signal 46.6 is 46.6 miles or 75 kilometres from Central, and signal 50 is 50 miles or 80.5 kilometres away. As a train approaches the city, the numbers on the signals gradually count down. The Indian Pacific was scheduled to arrive at Sydney Central Station by 9:15 a.m. But when it left Lithgow, it was running 6 minutes ahead of time. This meant the gap to the commuter train, W534 behind it, grew from 11 minutes to 17. That lead didn't last. The Indian Pacific had to stop at Katoomba Station to collect paperwork about speed restrictions further down the line. One of these included a 15.5 mile or 25 km per hour limit at Woodford. The stop, combined with the slower running, reduced the headway, the gap between the two trains, to just 15 minutes and 20 seconds by the time the Indian Pacific passed Valley Heights, a point about 5.3 miles or 8.6 kilometres north of Glenbrook. Meanwhile, train W534 had left Lithgow at 6:39 a.m. with driver Sinnott at the controls. The commuter service made its way down the Blue Mountains line, stopping at nearly every station along the route. By the time it reached Blacksland, it had picked up a small delay of 3 minutes, but overall, its journey remained routine and uneventful. As the Indian Pacific approached signal 42.0, just before Glenbrook station, the light showed yellow, caution. Driver Marshall reduced speed from 41 miles or 66 kilometers per hour down to 24 miles or 39 kilometers per hour. He later explained that he thought he was catching up to another slow commuter train ahead. At signal 46.1, the light was red. Marshall obeyed, bringing the train to a complete stop at 8:04 a.m., 3 minutes ahead of schedule, just past Glenbrook station. He climbed down from the cab and used the signal's phone to call the Penrith signal box. The signaller confirmed the red was in error and gave him permission to continue. Marshall restarted the Indian Pacific at 8:11 a.m., moving cautiously at no more than 11 miles or 18 kilometers per hour. But only a short distance ahead, at signal 40.8, the light was red again. He brought the train to another stop at 8:19 a.m. Investigators later noted the slow progress between the two signals as proof of driver Marshall's careful handling after being allowed past a red signal. At signal 40.8, the Indian Pacific came to a halt with its locomotive just a few feet beyond the signal. But because of the train's length, the rear car, a two-level car carrier, was more than 1,300 feet or 400 metres further back, standing in a rock cutting on a sharp left-hand curve. At the front, driver Willoughby, who had been at the controls earlier in the journey, stepped down to use the signal phone. But this time, the equipment was damaged, and he couldn't reach the signal box. With no way to make contact, Willoughby and Marshall agreed to proceed with extreme caution. At 8:22 a.m., the Indian Pacific slowly moved forward past the red signal. At 8:20 a.m., W534 pulled into Glenbrook station, still running 3 minutes late. After its short stop, the gap to the Indian Pacific ahead had shrunk to just over a single minute, cut down by the express train's slow running and repeated stops. Moments later, W534 also received permission to pass a red signal, signal 41.6, and continued down the same track. At 8:22 a.m. and 14 seconds, W534 rounded the curve in the cutting. In front of driver Mr. Sinnott, the nearly stationary rear of the Indian Pacific suddenly came into view. Just 4 seconds later, the commuter train slammed into the back of the car carrier at 37 kilometers per hour, or 33 miles per hour. In those final moments, Mr. Sinnott left his seat and rushed into the passenger compartment, barely escaping death. The collision destroyed his cab completely, as the double-deck car carrier sliced through the leading car of W534 like a pair of blades. The force of impact on the curved track lifted both trains from the rails, slamming them into the rock wall. 7 people lost their lives that morning. 51 more were injured. Just 22 seconds after the crash, Mr. Marshall placed the first call to emergency services. He had felt the violent jolt from the front of the train and knew instantly that something had gone terribly wrong. 17 minutes later, the first firefighters arrived. Instead of tracks, they found themselves standing on top of a sheer rock wall, looking down at the twisted remains of the V-set. They had been dispatched for a possible train collision. What lay below them was far worse than anyone had expected. Ladders and ropes were quickly set up to reach the wreckage faster than a long walk along the rails would allow. Survivors and rescuers alike later recalled the strange atmosphere that morning. It was a bright sunny day, a setting that felt almost wrong. As the first responders descended into the cutting, they noticed something chilling: silence. No cries for help, no shouts. Not even the sound of birds in the trees. As the scale of the disaster became clear, more and more rescue units were called in from farther afield. The danger was obvious. The crushed V-set leaned at a precarious angle, and responders feared it could tip or collapse completely at any moment. There was no time to wait for stabilization. Firefighters and paramedics pushed forward, prioritizing survivors trapped inside. They began working through the wrecked train car from back to front, but progress slowed as they reached the leading section. The collision had forced the car carrier deep into the V-set, driving the front wall several feet inward. What had once been nearly 20 feet of space was now compressed to just over 3. The front of the carriage had simply folded in on itself, leaving rescuers to cut and climb their way through mangled steel. To make matters worse, the inside of the train became an oven. Temperatures soared above 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. Crews could only last about an hour before they had to be rotated out, replaced by fresh teams to continue the desperate search for survivors. By the afternoon, every survivor had been pulled from the wreckage. But with that, responders faced the grim reality. No one in the forward passenger compartment had lived through the impact. One journalist later described the scene in haunting terms. He said the V-set had become like a tomb. Rescue crews cut away the twisted metal piece by piece, working with cold precision until, at last, they declared the train empty. And in that moment, he wrote, the birds began to sing again. As night fell, the site passed into the hands of investigators. Their mission was clear: to find out what had caused such devastation. Passengers on the Indian Pacific recalled being told only minutes before the crash that a signalling defect would cause a short delay. That clue gave investigators their first lead. The Indian Pacific was also equipped with a black box, a data logger, much like those used in airplanes. This device would prove critical, providing an exact record of the train's movements, unclouded by memory or confusion. The stretch of track where the collision happened was controlled from a signal box in Penrith. From there, operators managed signals and spoke with drivers, but they didn't have full train position indicators for the area. Instead, they relied on timetables and radio calls to estimate where trains were. Signalmen themselves admitted how unsafe this was. They even had a nickname for it: No Man's Land, or worse, Dark Territory. Concerns had been raised years earlier. Back in 1990, a State Rail Authority design manager, Mr. Alexander, was questioned on why Penrith and similar boxes lacked proper train tracking systems. His answer was simple: the signals were mostly automatic. Trains themselves triggered circuits in the track, marking sections as occupied. But when pressed on what happened during breakdowns or defects, his explanation fell apart. He repeatedly referenced so-called sufficient safe working units. Yet he couldn't clearly define what those units were. The discussion ended on the assumption that safety would simply rely on drivers showing extreme caution. The fact that older, non-automated systems actually had more detailed tracking equipment, including full position indicators, was brushed aside. To make matters worse, Penrith Signal Box once did have a system that tracked trains across the entire area. But in 1990, when the line was fully automated, most of it was removed. It was deemed unnecessary. The system's main purpose had been to manage trains that once terminated at Glenbrook station, a service later phased out. What remained was a stripped-down version, covering only Penrith itself. Everywhere else, controllers were left effectively blind. The signals near the crash site followed a simple but strict design. 3 lights stood in a vertical row, with a smaller marker light mounted off to the side. A red light in the vertical row, paired with the red marker light, meant stop. But the marker light had another critical role. If any part of the main signal failed, the marker would switch on automatically. In that case, drivers were told to ignore whatever the main signal showed, even if it displayed green or yellow. As long as the marker light was illuminated, the rule was absolute: you must stop. These signals also worked on an automatic system. Each one turned red as soon as a train passed it. and stayed red until that train was halfway between the next two signals down the line. Near Glenbrook, the key signals were 42.0, 41.6 and 40.8. In normal operation, once a train passed signal 42.0, it would stay red until the train reached signal 41.6. Then, as the train moved beyond the halfway point toward 40.8, signal 42.0 would finally change back to yellow. This system was designed with an extra margin of safety. The detection circuits for each signal overlapped, so even if a train moved past one signal, the earlier one would still register it. In theory, this made it harder for two trains to end up in the same section of track. On the morning of the crash, signal 40.8 suddenly switched to red, with no train ahead to explain it. That was why the Indian Pacific came to a halt. Investigators first checked for track damage that might have tricked the system into thinking the line was occupied. Finding none, they began dismantling the signals themselves, searching piece by piece for a fault. The answer lay in the power supply unit that served both signal 40.8 and signal 41.6. A single blown fuse had cut power to the sensing circuit. Without that signal, 40.8 could no longer detect whether a train was in the section beyond it. In response, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It shut down into fail-safe mode. The result was a solid red stop indication. Investigators eventually traced the problem back to the power supply itself. Inside, a diode on a circuit board had failed. This fault placed too much load on the system, blowing the fuse. That tiny defect, buried inside a sealed component of the unit, could never have been spotted during routine inspections. It was hidden from view. When the fuse failed, the signals reacted exactly as designed. They defaulted to red, the fail-safe position. In that sense, the system had worked. But in reality, this one hidden defect, a failed diode in a sealed power supply, became the root cause of the disaster that followed. So how did a single blown fuse turn into a fatal crash? The answer lies in communication, or more often, the lack of it. At the time, the trains and infrastructure involved relied on no fewer than 5 different and only partly compatible communication systems. First was Metronet radio, introduced just a year earlier for city rail services like the V-sets. It let drivers contact signal boxes at the push of a button, but it came with one serious flaw. Drivers could not speak directly to each other. Then there was CountryNet, an open radio channel used by freight and long-distance services like the Indian Pacific. Unlike Metronet, it did allow driver-to-driver communication. But V-set drivers weren't equipped with it. The older 450.50 system was still around too, though no longer primary. Both the Indian Pacific crew and the Penrith signal box had it, as did the conductor of the V-set. But the V-set's driver did not. Mobile phones added another layer. The Indian Pacific's crew carried them, and their locomotive could even route calls by satellite. But the V-set's driver and conductor had none. And finally, there were the signal telephones, crank-operated landline phones connected directly to the signal box. Everyone on the same stretch of track shared a party line, meaning if one person was talking, others could listen in. Individually, each system had its uses, but together they formed a patchwork of mismatched tools. And in the moments that mattered most, this web of gaps and incompatibilities left both trains on a collision course. Once trains passed Lithgow, drivers were not allowed to call signal boxes using train radios or even mobile phones. The only approved method was the brand new Metronet system. But here was the problem. The Indian Pacific wasn't fitted with Metronet. For trains like it, the rules required drivers to stop at the faulty signal and use the line-side telephone. The process was old-fashioned but simple. The driver opened the phone box and either cranked a handle or pressed a button to ring the signal box. A bell and a flashing light would alert the signalman, who would then pick up his handset and begin the conversation. Originally, that button was designed to interrupt the ringing so drivers could tap out coded messages, identifying themselves and their exact location. But in practice, it became just another fragile step in a system already full of cracks. On the morning of December 2nd, 1999, the Indian Pacific came to a halt at signal 41.6, right at the end of Glenbrook station. The signal refused to change. Mr. Willoughby, wearing his high-visibility jacket, climbed down from the locomotive and went to the signal phone. To his surprise, the box was locked and chained, something he hadn't seen in years. After fetching the key from the cab, he unlocked it, lifted the handset to check the line, then pressed the button and cranked the handle to ring through. On the other end, a voice answered, "Penrith here." It was signaller Mr. Mulholland. Willoughby identified himself and reported the unexplained red signal. Mulholland gave him permission to pass it and also asked him to report back on the next signal down the line. There was some confusion here. A follow-up question about how to proceed, which should have been answered with the words "with caution," was left unanswered. Later, Willoughby remembered telling his colleague, Mr. Marshall, that they had been cleared to go. Marshall, however, believed he had been told to proceed with caution. By the time the Indian Pacific finally eased past signal 41.6, it had already been delayed more than 7 minutes. Moving at little more than a crawl, it would take another 7 minutes to reach signal 40.8, creeping forward carefully in case danger lay ahead. Signaller Mr. Mulholland had cleared the Indian Pacific past the red signal because he knew the train ahead, the one Willoughby and Marshall feared they had caught up to, was still well ahead on the line. But investigators later ran into a troubling inconsistency. In his second interview, Mulholland claimed he had cleared the Indian Pacific not just past the faulty signal, but all the way through to MU planes. At times, even within minutes, he switched between the two accounts, sounding confused and unsure which version was correct. A recorded call placed shortly after the incident only deepened the mystery. In it, Mulholland told the Area Control Centre that he expected to hear from the Indian Pacific again at MU planes, suggesting that he may, in fact, have authorised the train to proceed much farther than originally thought. If true, it meant he was not expecting any further contact until the train had already traversed the critical section of track. 8 minutes after the Indian Pacific had been cleared, the commuter train W534 arrived at signal 41.6. Driver Sinnott used the Metronet radio to contact the Penrith signal box. What happened next can never be known with certainty. The signal telephone calls made by Willoughby were not recorded, and later Mulholland's own statements contradicted one another. But investigators believe Mulholland simply assumed that the Indian Pacific had already passed signal 40.8 on a clear, a green light, and was therefore well out of danger. Based on the timetable and the delay he knew the train had suffered earlier, Mulholland must have concluded that the Indian Pacific was further down the line than it actually was. Acting on this assumption, he authorised W534 to proceed past signal 41.6, even though the light glowed red. That signal was not just in fail-safe mode, it was also a true red, protecting the section of track where the Indian Pacific still sat. Because in reality, Willoughby had brought his train to a cautious halt at signal 40.8, where it remained waiting, the driver preparing to report yet another unexplained red. When Willoughby reached the signal telephone at 40.8, he made a troubling discovery. The box's chain and lock had already been broken, and inside, the crucial push-to-ring button was missing. He lifted the handset and listened. The line was quiet. Assuming the button might not be necessary, he cranked the handle several times, trying to raise the Penrith signal box. At first, nothing happened. Then faint voices drifted through the earpiece, muffled, distant, as if a conversation was taking place near an unattended handset left on a desk. Twice, Willoughby clearly identified himself, shouting his train's position into the line. but no one replied. Nobody seemed to even notice the inbound call. With the box visibly damaged and the telephone seemingly useless, he could only assume the system had been vandalized or was out of order. Defeated, Willoughby hung up the handset, closed the box, and walked back to his locomotive, unaware that his failed call had just sealed the fate of 2 trains. Investigators later examined the signal telephone at 40.8, running test after test. Each time, the device worked flawlessly. Calls went through. The buzzer at Penrith sounded as it should. This was in stark contrast to Willoughby's testimony, and to Mulholland's own statement, where he insisted he had never heard the buzzer when Willoughby tried to call. 2 scenarios were considered most likely. The first, that Mulholland had simply forgotten to press the cancel call button after finishing with the previous call from signal 41.6. If that were the case, the line would have remained open to the station platform, explaining why Willoughby heard those muffled voices, the chatter of people in the background, without anyone ever answering him. The second scenario was more complicated. It suggested that Willoughby's call came in while Mulholland was already speaking to driver Sinnott over the Metronet radio. In that case, Mulholland may have pressed the button to accept the signal phone call, but then simply set the handset down while continuing with Sinnott's conversation, forgetting that another train crew was waiting on the line. Another possibility was that Sinnott's radio call continued until after Willoughby had already hung up and walked back to his locomotive. Either way, Willoughby's attempt to report the second red signal never reached the signal box, leaving Mulholland to believe the Indian Pacific was further down the line than it really was. In his call to the Area Control Centre, Mr. Mulholland mentioned dealing with a lot of, as he put it, dramas. His workload seemed so heavy that he even asked the centre to organise an electrician to fix signal 41.6, rather than arranging it himself. While the exact nature of these dramas was never made clear, they may explain why he forgot about the earlier call from the Indian Pacific. Mulholland also did not anticipate the Indian Pacific moving past signal 41.6 at extreme caution, in other words, at a very slow pace. He likely assumed the train was running closer to normal speed. By that expectation, it would already have been well beyond signal 40.8 by the time Willoughby attempted his call there. The Indian Pacific's data recorder shows its brakes releasing at 8:21 and 47 seconds, ending its stop at signal 40.8. Just 2 seconds later, the Metronet call between W534 and the signal box concluded. After wrapping up the conversation with Mr. Sinnott, Mr. Mulholland suddenly realised that the Indian Pacific, which should have arrived at his local station at 8:20, had never appeared. He quickly switched to the CountryNet radio system and contacted the crew. Their reply was chilling. They reported receiving, in their words, a large shunt in the back, and urged him to notify emergency services at once. Something had gone terribly wrong. The final investigation report listed no fewer than 23 contributing factors, but it highlighted several major ones. Nearly all rooted in communications failures. Had the Indian Pacific been allowed to use its in-cab radio to contact the signal box, its delay would have been far shorter, perhaps avoided entirely. Mr. Sinnott, at the controls of W534, had been told by Mr. Brown, the area train controller, to just trip past the red signal. That casual phrasing, later reinforced by equally informal communication with Mr. Mulholland, encouraged him to proceed at full line speed, rather than creeping forward cautiously as the Indian Pacific had done. And finally, if both trains had shared a compatible radio system, the crews could have heard each other's conversations, perhaps even exchanged direct warnings. But the Indian Pacific was effectively locked out of the Metronet system, while the old signal telephones could only be used by trains stopped beside them. The result was silence between the two trains, right up until the moment of impact. The investigation concluded with a sweeping set of recommendations aimed at overhauling operational safety. Among them, the introduction of a single shared radio system for every train on the City Rail network. Train position indicators covering not just stations, but the entire network, and strict adherence to formal communication protocols to eliminate the risks of vague or casual instructions. Crews were to receive better training, ensuring that any suspected faulty signal would only ever be passed at extreme caution. Once such a shared radio system was in place, the antiquated signal telephones, relics of an earlier era, were also to be reconsidered. The scale of the findings was extraordinary. The presiding judge later revisited the case, doubling down on the report and expanding its scope. By the time his extension was published, the number of safety recommendations stood at 95, a record figure for any rail crash investigation in Australia's history. 95 recommendations came out of the inquiry, but the real question remains: how many of these lessons were truly learned? Should trains have been allowed to run with 5 different incompatible communication systems? Should fail-safe signals really depend so heavily on human judgment and memory? And perhaps most importantly, do we only make safety a priority after tragedy strikes? What do you think? Was this disaster unavoidable, given the technology of the time, or was it the result of a system that put convenience ahead of safety? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.